What's up, guys? Welcome back to Tidal Gardens. This past month has been a whirlwind, and I found myself at a show in the Netherlands called Vivarium. If you followed the past few videos on this channel, yes, that would mean that I spent a week in the UK, came back, and then turned right back around to the Netherlands a couple weeks later. That is a lot of travel for someone like me that does not get out much. Vivarium was brought to my attention by Paul Hughes from Advanced Aquarium Consultancy. He said, there is this amazing show happening in a few weeks in the Netherlands. I realize that it's a super short notice thing and a really fast turnaround for you, but this show is likely the best aquatics only show in Europe, and it's super cool. Like when most people pitch me an idea, I said no. But once I got home, I was thinking, I might be able to somehow squeeze this trip in. Just for fun, I asked around as to where people would be staying, how they were planning on getting from point A to point B. Honestly, I never really thought that it would come together. I've never been to the Netherlands before, so there was a lot of logistics questions that I had. Long story short, Alex from Abiz stepped up big time. This wasn't a sponsored visit by any stretch, but he facilitated literally everything for me. Transport to and from the airport, lodging, and on top of that, we got to see some behind the scenes at a whole bunch of really cool places outside of the Vivarium trade show. So, real quick, big shout out to the entire Abiz team. Again, not sponsored, but make no mistake, they moved heaven and earth to make my trip there possible. Anyway, let me tell you about this show. First off, it was very big. If I had to guess, there were between 12,000 to 15,000 people in attendance. To put that into perspective for the folks that don't get out to these shows very often, that is like 2 to 3 times bigger than the biggest shows in the US. I got asked over and over, what did I think of it compared to the US shows? And yes, straight up, it's bigger. The locals were super surprised to hear that because I think that the perception is that everything in the US is larger, but there's not that many shows in Europe. In the US, there are, I don't know, hundreds each year. And I think that the number of events is causing a bit of, I don't know, what I would call event fatigue happening. There are some freshwater and saltwater shows in the US that are a good size, no doubt, but there's a lot of competition for that attention, even amongst the same, let's say, brand of show, like Reef Stock, Reefapalooza, Aquashella. There are multiple of each of those events. Having a single, more concentrated show environment in Europe, I think, had a lot to do with this huge turnout. If I was to describe it, it feels like an early 2000 era Magna when it was the only really big industry show around. The second thing that I found really refreshing about this show is all the European brands. Before, the place to see some of these companies would have been Magna, but now that that's gone, there are so many US shows that the attendance of brands from overseas has become more and more sparse. So every show might just have like a couple of these types of companies. And here, having a European show like Vivarium, much bigger concentration. There were people that I've been emailing back and forth with for years that I'm only now getting to meet in person. All right, so that's kind of the general background of the show. Let's talk about some of the highlights of this show that you guys might actually find interesting. I got to start with Abiz. If you've spent any time on this channel, I am an unapologetic super fan of these pumps. After my experience on this trip, I am that much more solidified on the brand, and I really hope to do a lot more work with them in the future. There's no pump out there that is perfect at any price point, but there are some companies that are a heck of a lot closer than others. And companies like Abiz, I appreciate because they're making an effort to make the best cost no object product in the world. After spending a week with the Abiz team, I heard all kinds of funny stories about the insane build quality of these pumps. I'll share two of them with you real quick. The first one is about this orange cord that's become like this visual staple of Abiz. Alex from Abiz was looking for the best cable that he could find that performs in the harshest conditions imaginable. Like, for example, the open ocean, where it's going to get beaten up by the weather. There's going to be weird, creepy crawlies that probably want to dig into, soft rubber type compounds like this, and the UV exposure from the sun. They settled on this particular supplier's cord. So the story is one of the other pump manufacturers was really interested in using this same cord. So they went to that manufacturer and they got a price quote for an insane length. I think it might have been like hundreds of kilometers, something like that. Way, way more volume than what Abiz would be buying because this particular pump maker sells orders of magnitude more pumps. They decided to not use this cord because this cord is so expensive that if this other manufacturer went with it, it would comprise 40% of the material cost of their entire pump. Yeah. Second story. So back at Tidal Gardens, I happened to misplace 6 tiny screws on their AFC 150 power head. We needed to take off the titanium shell for filming the interior parts of it, and we never put the small set screws back in. It just kind of like sat there and they got misplaced. I don't even know how we lost track of them, but they're just gone. Instead of bothering Abiz immediately, I decided just to get the specs for them and order them myself off of Amazon. Big mistake. Guess how much 6 tiny grade 2 titanium screws are? They're $100. $100 for these tiny little screws. I immediately went to Abiz and was like, hey, is there any way that this is still covered under warranty? Luckily, they were. As you can see, these sorts of things add up to what amounts to one of the most expensive pumps in the industry. But I love the commitment to trying to make the best thing ever. Speaking of the best thing ever, there was an acrylic manufacturing company that shared this booth with Abiz called Newwave. It was a company started by Florian Schuron. If that name sounds familiar at all, there was a company called Schuron that makes commercial grade equipment like skimmers and whatnot. More popular, I would say, in like the 90s and early 2000s. You may have heard of it. I don't know. But Florian is the son of the owner of that company, and he was the one that started Newwave. First impression, these tanks that are on display and these skimmers are absolutely nuts. I'm not the biggest fan of acrylic because, frankly, when I look at them wrong, they scratch. But if you are into acrylic, I don't think I've ever seen acrylic work this good. Look at the detail work on these tanks. The seams are perfect. They're super thick. And one particular seam that I saw was maybe like 3-4 inches or something. It was insane. And there isn't a single bubble, like nothing. Also, the top edge of this particular show tank is this crazy 3-way 45-degree bevel. It looks like a jewel. And again, perfect seams. Freaking blown away by their build quality. I typically travel light to these types of shows, but I made a huge exception for this particular trip. I bought 2 small chrysal tanks for a future project here. I want to breed some tuxedo urchins, and you know what? I'm going to figure it out. But believe me, I was sweating that whole checked luggage procedure, right? I was just hoping that they would make it back here in one piece, and luckily, I can say that they made it. I never expected to be buying tanks on my trip, but it's hard to source chrysal tanks in the US. And at the build quality of the Newwave ones, it's practically unheard of. So that was my big souvenir. Next up, the majority of the space at Vivarium was freshwater. I would say maybe 65% of it was probably freshwater. And my favorite booth was Aqua Flora. I know nothing about this company, so you'll have to do that research on your own. But their display was expansive and gorgeous. They had this enormous aquascaped planted aquarium that looks like it's like a perfect public aquarium exhibit, and they set this up for a trade show. What stood out? Crystal clear and just meticulously assembled. Gorgeous, gorgeous tank. Off to the side, they had this interesting paludarium that was shrouded in mist. Sometimes I wonder if like the misting type displays are kind of gimmicky. I wonder if that's the perception, but I love the effect. Real quick, does this tank look familiar? Yep, it's Newwave. So cool how that 45-degree bevel seems to hold in the mist. Aquaflora also had this long picnic bench, and on that bench, they had these smaller tabletop displays. It's actually something that I might be able to work into my office design here at Tidal Gardens. Very cool setup. All right, enough freshwater. Let's go back to Saltwater Land. Look at these coral saws. I don't know why we haven't seen this sort of thing pop up in the US yet, but it needs to happen. There were a couple of companies that were modifying griffin saws. Griffin saws, for the coral farmers out there, they're kind of like the industry standard, but they are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. The efforts by these companies gets it a lot closer. There's a lot of custom 3D printed stuff. And I wanted to point out the extent of this customization that's going on. This one in particular has custom top and bottom wheels with deeper channels so you won't get that saw blade slippage. Griffin saw owners, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When they age a little bit of that wheel gets damaged over time, and eventually that bandsaw blade keeps popping off, and you have to get new wheel replacements. These custom wheels, likely much, much better. Also, this saw has replaced the 110 volt motor with a DC variable speed motor, and it has a remote mean well power supply. That seems like a great idea. Much less risk of electrical shock with DC voltages, and you get the benefit of variable cutting speeds and a soft ramp up. Also, guys, integrated LEDs at the cutting point. We have been using Kessels or AI lights at our saw station, but these saws have them built in at the device itself. Good idea, right? Lastly, I don't think this particular one had this feature, but I've seen others that had peristaltic pump hookups at different locations on the saw to allow for water delivery. Oftentimes, you want to be dripping water down on the saw blade at different locations to both rinse the saw and cool the blade. The peristaltic pumps would allow you to do that at whatever water volume you're looking to do and from water sources potentially far away. All of these units are 3D printed, so I imagine it's just a matter of time before they have every feature imaginable. Moving on, I wanted to briefly mention Tunza. This is a brand that I've really not messed with in ages. Back in the 90s, they were the premier pump brand. Somewhere in the 2000s, they were kind of out of sight, out of mind, and other pump brands took over that spot in the reef aquarium zeitgeist, like Ecotech and to a lesser degree the Gyre style pumps. Tunza is now a third generation family owned company, and this is the first time that I ever got a chance to sit down with them. I came away with a very good impression of their current owner, Felix, and I might try some of their pumps in the future. Obviously, I'm still an Abiz fanboy, but let's be real, not every system of ours requires the insane commercial build like Abiz. Sometimes we're just setting up something smaller, and I can see where pumps like Tunza could fit that application. Getting reacquainted with the brand was nice because I think our experiences with it are a full 4 product generations behind. And there are some really cool innovations in the most recent product line, such as being able to take out the impeller from the front. Easy maintenance, right? But also, they're doing some pretty exotic stuff. Like they have a pump that uses a radial magnetic bearing pumping system. It's an odd mounting profile, so I have to give that some thought. But the radial magnetic bearing means that the magnetic field itself holds the rotor in place, making it basically frictionlessly spin. I don't think anybody else uses this technology. Also, their newest auto top off is a crazy cool product. I would do it a disservice by trying to explain all the technology in it, but it is likely as good as it gets. I encourage you to watch their video on it to explain all the different features and fail-safes. If I ever visit Germany, Tunza is one of the companies I would really like to see the operation of. Because from what I understand, almost all the assembly is done by hand at that location, and they go through great lengths sourcing all their materials. Moving on, I got to meet up with Eves and Corey from Niosh slash White Corals slash ATI. Always fun to talk shop with them because there's only so many top tier coral farms in the world, of which White Corals is one. The thing that I was most interested in seeing in person at that Niosh booth was the ATI Stratton LED fixture. If you're unfamiliar with it, it is this super expensive, super thin LED that almost nobody in the US has. So seeing them in person was a treat. Couple of quick observations. First, they really are insanely thin. Imagine thinner than an iPhone with a case. That's how thin it is. Also, there are no fans. So one would think that they must get cooking hot, but it turns out that the whole case is a heatsink and it was cool to the touch. Weirdly cool to the touch. Not sure how they accomplished that. I have to be honest though, when I looked at this booth display, the spectrum of the lights, they didn't really pop like I'm used to seeing in Ecotech Radions. I get it. Ecotech gets a lot of grief online, but one thing I will never ever knock Ecotech for is the aesthetics of their spectrum. Corals look fantastic under them. I think, though, that with these ATI Strattons, it was just how they were dialed in. Because later on in this trip to the Netherlands, we visited the home of a local hobbyist named Wesley, and his show tank was illuminated by 6 Stratton fixtures. And the way that he had them dialed in looked way more balanced and aesthetically pleasing. The price of the fixtures would make it a little hard to stomach for a giant coral farm like Tidal Gardens, but I could see for like a large show tank, it's certainly a light that I would consider in a super high-end install. The fact that it doesn't have any fans, it's going to be nice and quiet, it's a huge selling point, obviously, for me. And that super thin, elegant look, I would say it is the most striking looking fixture. Finally, I will leave you with a teaser for a future video. The De Jong booth. De Jong Marine Life is pure insanity. They deserve their own video entirely, but you'll have to wait. Happy reefing. Bye now.